Were you destined to be a lawyer?
I guess so, because when I was in the Navy, getting out of the Navy, Carol and I were married, and I thought I was going to get out of the Navy and come back to Jamestown and go into business or something of that nature. But what I had 2 degrees in business, but I took the business school tests, and I didn't do very well in that test. And then I took the law school test, and I did very well. So that told me something.
What did your mom and dad do? Can you give a little biography on both of them?
Yeah, my father was graduated from Cornell University as an engineer, and he came back to Jamestown in the early 1900s, well, middle 1900s.
And your dad's name was?
Elmer W. And he joined Sellstrom company, which was fairly new at the time, and he was superintendent and general manager of the Sellstrom company, and he stayed with them for up until the 1930s, and the Depression hit, and then he retired, and he became active in the masonry, and he was a 33rd degree Mason, and then he was city treasurer in Jamestown for a period of time, and he basically was home with my mother. My mother died when I was only 9 years old, so my father became sole parent, and he devoted himself to bringing me up, and was active in very community fairs in Jamestown.
And your mother?
My mother was the daughter of William J. Lauster, who came to Jamestown in the early 1900s, and he owned an automatic voting machine. He had the patents on some of the vital parts of the voting machine, and he owned that until the time of his unfortunate death at a very early age as a result of a fall from the horse. So the automatic voting machine was sold shortly thereafter.
You mentioned a horse. I know of some knowledge that Elmer Sellstrom and Mr. Barger and Robert Jackson had a horse farm. What's the story behind all that?
Well, I guess in the 1930s, before Jackson became so involved in the state affairs and so on while he was practicing law, the 3 fellows got together and decided that they'd like to own a farm, a horse farm. And they bought the property up in Lakewood, quite a considerable piece of property with a racetrack around it. And they had a barn right on the highway up there. And I remember that as a small boy, and they each had horses up there. And Jackson and my father primarily and my aunt Emily, who was a horsewoman, my father's sister, she loved to ride horses too. So Jackson and my father met up there on Sunday mornings usually and rode horses. And I was a small boy, and I went and tagged along.
Do you have a corporate memory of Jackson?
Yeah, I do. I can remember him, not very well, but I certainly do remember, and I associate him with what they call the stock farm.
Mm-hmm. Your dad was involved with the 33rd degree Masons. Were you as well?
Yes, I'm a 32nd degree Mason,
right.
But I joined at an early age because my father was so active in it, and I enjoyed that. I'm not active in it as much as I used to be.
You involved? Did you belong to the Scottish Rite Consistory?
Yes, and the Shriners and the whole 9 yards.
Well, it's funny coming back when I did in the late '70s. You were almost expected as a lawyer to join.
Right. That and the Rotary Club and various civic organizations throughout the community.
So going back biographically, I suppose we should just point out the fact you were born in 1933. You're a graduate of Jamestown High School?
No, I went to prep school,
Prep school? Where'd you go?
Governor's Academy in Massachusetts.
Now, was that something you selected or your dad selected?
Well, it was a combination of both, I think. My father was looking for me to have the experience of going elsewhere. I was about 14 years of age, and he felt that I should get better prepared for college work and university work. And so we were looking at prep schools it was quite fashionable in those days to go to a prep school. And I wound up at the Governor's, which is the oldest boarding school in America. And I spent 4 years.
Then from there you went?
From there I went to a place called Nichols College in Massachusetts, which was a business school. And I was there, and then I transferred to Eastern Michigan University, and I did work at University of Michigan as well. I got my degree from Eastern Michigan.
In economics?
Yes.
Which then you, from there, when you decided to go in to get your Doctors of Law, where'd you go?
No, I had a period. I was in the Naval Reserve by that point.
Yep.
And I was fortunate enough to I got into the program, which was a Naval Security Group. So I was dealing in top secret stuff. And I was assigned after I graduated from college to the Naval Security Group out in California. And so I moved to California and was involved with the Navy out there for 3 years.
Did you find that, was law part of your world then?
Only to the extent of I was so close to Tijuana, and some of the sailors on the base would go down to Tijuana at night, and they'd get married and divorced on the same night. And my job, one of my jobs, was to go down there and get them bailed out and get them back in the United States. So I did that for some time, but my main job was delivering courier material, top secret material, to all areas around California and Nevada.
So give me your best story, your best Tijuana story. Right now I'm visualizing some craziest things.
Well, the answer to that is that basically these sailors would be out on a ship, and they'd come in, and they were just ready to get drunk and get into trouble. And so oftentimes they did, and they wind up in a jail down there. And so I had the authority to go down there and bring them back, and I usually took somebody with me to escort them back and get them back. It was a much simpler life at that time, though.
Did you have any sense that you might stay in the Navy, that as a career?
Well, I was offered a unique position. I was on a small base, and as I say, I was a security in this, and my commanding officer, my superior, was a rear admiral. And he took a liking to me, and he liked to play golf. He was a fabulous golfer, and at that period of time, I was young, and I loved golf, and I was never as good as he was, but he liked to play golf with me, and he'd say, "Sellstrom, we're going to play golf today." "Yes, sir, we're going to play golf." So that's what happened.
During your time in the service, you met and married somebody named Carol Wilson Bauer. How'd that all happen?
Well, actually, that didn't happen when I was in the Navy. That happened before the Navy at the University of Michigan. And we met on a blind date. It wasn't blind from my standpoint, but both of us were dating somebody else. Carol and I had a mutual friend, a girl by the name of Monica Morrison at that time. And Monica was a friend of mine who's, I'd have dates with her to go study, and then I'd take her out afterwards. But she kept telling me that she wanted me to meet this girl, and she said, "This is a perfect girl for you." And I was dating somebody else, and Carol was dating somebody else, and then we were in the library one time, the two of us, and Carol walked in, and she said, "That's the girl I want you to meet." I said, "Okay." And the rest is history.
The rest is history. Fantastic. Obviously, you're very Swedish. That's your background, Sellstrom. Did you, growing up with your mom and dad, was Christmas, here we are in the Christmas season, the core of the Lingen, the Lutefisk, was that all part of your tradition?
Very, very definitely. It started with my grandmother, Sellstrom, who was very Swedish, an immigrant, and my grandfather, too, who had a home at 611 Jefferson Street, which we would always go to. And she was very insistent that every Sunday night the family gathered there. That's rather the old Swedish traditions, and we would always have tongue and all the goodies that everybody loves. That were Swedish, and of course Christmas was the big show. And so as a small child, I remember going there usually on Christmas Eve and having Christmas Eve there.
Did you have glue? Did you
Oh,
have
yeah.
The whole nine?
The whole 9 yards.
Did you like Lutefisk?
No, although I never dared admit that. And finally, when I introduced my family to it, and Carol, and the kids, and some of the grandkids to it, we always had it as tradition. But it got down to the point that I was the only one that would eat it, and finally I decided I didn't want it anymore. So,
Gosh, that sounds very familiar.
yeah.
Because my mother's family were the Carlsons, Viking food, and
Yes.
all that stuff. So.
Well, I have to tell you the story about Lutefisk. The story is it hangs up in Sweden. It hangs up in the area to get good and right, but it isn't any good until some dogs have come and peed on it. So I don't eat it anymore.
Well, we don't either. But here you found yourself. I'm going to skip ahead just a little bit, but while we're on the Swedish subject, you were consul for many, many years,
Yep.
Swedish consul. How did that happen?
Well, you may recall that Dan Isaacson was the consul before I was, and Dan was an attorney in Jamestown, a very good attorney, and he actually was never really consul. He was vice consul. He was a vice consul. But when he decided to, he moved south, and the position became open. And Dan strongly recommended me, which was very nice of him. And so the Swedish government came in here back in the 70s and interviewed me, and they actually moved. They sent a fellow here who was an ambassador rank. He'd been an ambassador in I forget, Tunisia. He was an ambassador to Tunisia, and his name was Tersmeden, and he took it very seriously, this business of selecting a consul. So he came and he spent several days in Jamestown. And he did a total investigation of me, and what really got to me was the fact that he went up to schools where my kids were, and he interviewed the teachers, they went so far as to do that. And then I got the word that I was accepted, and they had changed it at that point, so they made this a full consulate.
What was the role of council?
Well, it was perhaps much more important in the era of the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and into the 90s, because it was primarily to introduce Swedish industrialists into the United States who may want to relocate some of their business or promote trade. And it's more and more that way now than anything. And then our job was to handle passports. We issued passports, and we did visas, and we did all that stuff. And it's now all the Swedes, as you know, speak English, and also they have their own connections in the United States. So the Swedish consul role today is much, much diminished from what it was at the time that I started.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Which your son is the current consul.
Yes, that's correct.
Going back to your biography, you go to the University of Wisconsin, get your degrees there. Did you think you were coming back here?
No. I was discharged from the Navy in early December, and law schools at that time didn't accept you for entrance into law school in January. But there were two schools that did. One was William and Mary, and one was the University of Wisconsin. And so when I was going to be discharged, I had married Carol, and we had a baby on the way. And I decided that I better get to work, and I didn't want to wait 6 months to go to law school. So I applied to both, and I got into both. And because of my Midwest connections and loving the Midwest as I did, and Carol being a Midwesterner, we chose to go to the University of Wisconsin. And another reason that I went to Wisconsin was our family attorney was D. Lawrence Carlson, and it was a very good friend of my father's. And I'd go into the office with my father and see that big diploma up there, University of Wisconsin, and I thought that might be pretty good.
And when you graduated, was there a gravity pull here?
Yes, I actually started practicing in Wisconsin. I had a internship with a law firm in Madison, and they offered me a position. But at that time, my father had remarried, and there was considerable attraction to come back to Jamestown, because I'd also worked with a law firm, Lombardo and Pickard, and I'd had an internship with them, and they also offered me a position, and so I came back to Jamestown to join them.
Let's talk about those two individuals who are, I remember Mike Lombardo, but what was Mike Lombardo like?
Well, I'll tell you in a short sentence. Walter Winchell was a noted radio man in the 40s and 30s. And he went coast to coast on his broadcasts, and usually on a Sunday night. But I can best describe Mike as Walter Winchell did. He said, if you ever want to commit murder, go up to Chautauqua County and hire a lawyer by the name of Lombardo, because he was a very, very good lawyer and a trial lawyer. And he did, there are all sorts of legends about him, and that I was very fortunate to come under his tutelage, because He was a great teacher. And Clarence Pickard Clarence Pickard never went to law school. He graduated from Hamilton College, and his father was a lawyer here in Jamestown, and he joined his father in the practice of law, and his father taught him. And he was like someone like Jackson in a way, but he never went to law school. But he was brilliant, and he would be a fellow that would, when I came back here, he'd say, well, I want you to look up this point of law. There was a case back in the 1920s, somewhere in that area, that said this, and I want you to find that case. Well, I dug and dug and dug, but sure enough, that case was there, and that was the point that he wanted me to research. So he had an encyclopedia mind, and he was recognized as being just a terrific lawyer in research and all that.
Because that's the impression I was given, that Mr. Outside was Lombardo, Pickard was Mr. Inside.
Correct.
Now, Mr. Pickard, he didn't. Did he practice much longer after you came back?
Well, he was a very, very heavy man. Yeah, a very heavy man. He loved the arts, and he was very active in Chautauqua and civic music and so on. And he practiced. Well, they hired me. And I was in there, and unfortunately, Clarence died probably 3 or 4 years after I joined the firm. And then Mike and I formed a partnership. We never had a partnership agreement between us. We had a handshake, and I never had an argument with Mike. I mean, he was just wonderful. I mean, his word was gold. He just, whatever he said, that was it. And the other story I love to tell about Mike is one time I was arguing in the Court of Appeals, which is the highest court in New York State, and I was before the court, and I presented my argument. I had a flight, taking me back from Albany. At that time, they flew into Jamestown, and I finished, and I was packing up my bag, and Mr. Sellstrom, I'd like to see you in chambers immediately following. Oh my God, what did I do? And Judge Jason, he called me in, and I thought, oh my God. And I had to stay for several hours. So I missed my flight, But anyway, he calls me in, and I go trembling in, and he said, how the hell is Mike? So he was well known and very. He and Willard Cass Sr. Were very, very close friends, and their wives were very close, and they did a lot of things together. And that was in the Prohibition days, where they spent a good deal of time in those days getting people out of jail and from raids and Prohibition.
Now, Mike had to be one of the probably first Italian lawyers.
He was the first.
Was he?
Mm-hmm.
Did you talk much about the good old days? Because it had to have been a little bit of difficulty with that fact.
Well, I like to say this. I think that everybody that lived in Chautauqua County had been touched by Mike Lombardo. I mean, either as a client or somebody that knew, or he had a vast amount of respect and recognized as being one of the top lawyers. Was
he principally a criminal lawyer?
Started out that way, and as a result of that, I got to learn a lot of criminal law, and I was assigned by the judges because I was Mike's protege, so to speak. So I did a lot of criminal work in the early days. But yeah, he did a lot of negligence work, and we defended a lot of insurance companies too. He did a lot of defense work. He was on both sides of the spectrum. He did plaintiff's work, and he did defendant's work because he was defending insurance companies. They don't do that anymore. You're either one or the other.
Was there early on in your career, was there a niche where you said, gee, I really am passionate about this type of practice?
Well, I never did like criminal law. And so I gradually weaned myself away from that. I was assigned to go to Attica many times and see criminals, and that just wasn't my style. And so as time developed, and I didn't do so much anymore. And I didn't, in the last several years, I didn't do any of it.
Yeah, you're of course incredibly well known with your estate tax, and
Yeah.
abilities. And
Well,
what was the segue to that?
Well, I think Clarence Pickard had he had a good number of clients who he had planned the estates for, and he did the estate work, and so I kind of inherited that. And then when Dan Isaacson left, I inherited sort of his practice. And then when Sam Conti retired, Sam and Mike were very, very close. Sam outlived Mike, but Sam had a good estate practice. He was. They had at that time they had a New York State attorney, which was Sam, who had to be there when you open a safe deposit box, and you had to, various things that he had to do. So, in essence, I wound up with his practice too.
Then at some point it becomes your firm expands.
Mm-hmm.
What was that process?
Well, it started out when Dalton Burgett was a graduate of Cornell, and he applied for a job with us. He was from Dunkirk, and so we hired him. Mike and I hired him, and then thereafter, Dale Robbins, he clerked for me one summer when he was at Duke Law, and then he came in after he graduated and joined the firm. So ultimately it became Lombardo, Sellstrom, and Burgett. And then in the early 80s, we were originally in the Fenton building. Mm-hmm. And then after Clarence's death, we moved over to the Hotel Jamestown, and we redesigned and redid the sixth floor, I think it was, for our offices, Mike and my office. And then thereafter, we hired Chuck Hall, who graduated. He's a CPA and also an attorney, and we hired him. And then in I guess the early 80s, this building, the Fourth and Pine, came available, and so basically I became a partner in the venture that bought this building. And we moved over here. I myself moved over here, and Dalton and Dale formed a partnership. And then Chuck formed his own, and we split out.
Mike Lombardo, I certainly have a memory of him and seeing around. Did he stay with you until he died?
Yes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. He retired though, but he was well into his late 80s when he died. Mm-hmm. His wife, they were very close, and his wife's name was Bertha. And Bertha, unfortunately, suffered from diabetes, and they were very careful, but they loved to go to town. He was an instrumental in the town club. Yeah, he was one of the founders of the town club, and he was at that time the town club was owned by about 30 people. There were the regular members, and then there were the social members. But Mike was a regular member, And he made me a regular member, and I became a director of the town club, and I was for several years, 20 years or so. But Mike was a great friend of George Chambers, who was the original owner and the brains behind the town club. And they used to have raids at the town club because they had stop machines upstairs. And so Mike would get them all out of trouble and everything of this nature. But there are a lot of stories that surround all that, and there are a lot of good stories.
Like one. Give me your best town club story.
Regarding the town club?
Well, town club or even a Mike Lombardo story.
Well, I love to tell the story about the last case that Mike, maybe I shouldn't do this, but it's a matter of public record, and it's a great story. And Mike, there was an attorney that got in trouble in Jamestown, and because there was a fellow that went through the neighborhood with a speaker on the top of his car. He was campaigning for an elective office. And this fellow was on a Sunday morning, and this fellow was in a nice neighborhood where this fellow, the attorney, lived. And the attorney went out and they got into a kind of a shouting match. And this attorney grabbed the speaker system and tore it off the car and did everything else. And so he was arrested. Mm-hmm. Well, of course, that created a stir in everything, and it wound up being transferred because everybody knew everybody in Jamestown, so they went to Dunkirk. And this is the last case that Mike tried. And I was with him. I was backstopping him, and I was with him in the courtroom. And Mike was, this fellow got on, and they they examined him, the district attorney, and so on and so forth. And he goes through the spiel and everything. So Mike cross-examined. It was before a jury. And Mike cross-examined him. He says, well, Mr. So-and-so, he says, what happened? He described it. He said, well, were you hurt in any way? Are you injured in any way? Oh, no. Well, he says, what? It's just so it was torn off. Well, what's the big deal? And he said, this fellow says, well, Mr. Lombardo, he said, this lawyer called me a goddamn whop, and Mike says, well, how does that hurt you? And he said, Mr. Lombardo, haven't you ever been called a goddamn whop? And he said, many times, but I never had anybody arrested for. And it broke up the jury, and that was the end of the case.
That's terrific.
That was the last case he ever tried.
Okay. Talk about clients, and you know, we don't want to belie any confidences, but you are the trustee of the Johnson Foundation, incredibly well known in our community, and you've done incredible work. But talk to me about John and Johnson and his brother, who probably isn't known as well.
Yes. Well, his brother died before I came into the picture. Okay. His brother died in the early 70s. And John was the younger brother. And, excuse me, I've got just a little frog. But he worked in Jamestown as a laborer at Mount Rockwell. And the two brothers never married. He came here in the 20s to join his brother. And they lived together until Oscar passed away. But his brother built houses in Jamestown, a number of them, and for the Swedish community. And John would join him evenings and help him and do that. So, make a long story short, when his brother died, John had retired, and he decided that he was going to sell his house. I'm not quite sure. Some people tell me that it was up on Sweet Hill, and some people tell me it was on Buffalo Street Extension. I handled the transaction, but I can't remember where it was. And to move into Jamestown, he needed a lawyer, and so he came in to see me because I was a Swedish consul at that time. And so I asked him, I said, how'd you find me? And he says, you're the Swedish consul. And if you're good enough for them, you're good enough for me. So we then found, he came to depend upon me a lot at this point. He was in failing health, and he ultimately went blind. But he was very, very independent. He was a fellow that you couldn't, he was what they call a tough old Swede, and he wouldn't listen to anything. You couldn't get him to go have help, or you couldn't get him into a nursing home. He wouldn't, no way. And so he, in the meantime, he used to be Good Buddies and Company, and they, at the time I remember, they were over here on, they were on Pine Street. I guess they were on Pine Street. They were a Pine or Cherry they were, but there used to be a stock company, and he would like to go in there during the day, and at that time they had the stock quotes going across the thing. And he became friends with Gordon Parsons, who was one of the old-time stockbrokers in Jamestown, and Gordon gave him a lot of good advice. And he made investments, but he never sold anything. He just, his philosophy was, well, I bought it, I'm going to hang on to it. So he bought a company called Dover Elevator. And I guess it was probably, he put maybe $10,000 or $20,000 into it at the time. And at the time he died, it was over $5 million. Just that company. But he also had some other good stocks and very, very fine companies that Gordon helped him with. And as time went on, as I said, he began to rely on me and Gordon. And then eventually Gordon retired, and he's passed on now too. But John would not sell anything. So I had a mishmash when to do his estate of all these different securities. But he came in one day and he said, well, want to do my will. And he says, but he says, I got so much money, I have, I'm a millionaire. And I said, well, yes, you are, several times over. And he says, I'd like to give it to you. And I said, you can't give it to me. I said, I can't do it. He says, you take it, and I know that you'll give it away to the right things. Mm-hmm. And I said, well, you can't do that, but I'll tell you what we can do. We can establish a memorial trust and foundation, and we'll go that route. And what are your interests? What do you want after? Well, he says, I think the thing that I'm most interested in is the Salvation Army. I said, okay. And he says, we talked about it, and he says, why don't I give all the income from this, or set it up for 20 years. I explained it to him, what we're going to do. And we'll give all the income to the Salvation Army, and then you give the rest away anytime you want over that period of 20 years. Okay, and I said, well, I don't know what your interests are. Well, his interests were anything Swedish, anything with children, anything with old people. And I wasn't prohibited from Chautauqua County, but the emphasis was on Jamestown and Chautauqua County. and we've adhered to that as best we can. So the millions of dollars have passed in that 20 years to the many organizations that was categorized as worthy organizations in Jamestown, New York, and it's ranged the gamut of every organization here that meets that criterion. And basically, Carol and I, my wife Carol, acts as the executive director. She knew John, and so we've tried to carry out that charge that we had, and we're coming to an end now. The 20 years is up in 2016, and we indeed have passed on several millions of dollars in the community. And we are in the process of so-called sunsetting the foundation, and it's coming to an end. But so there have been major gifts that have been made. And I come to mind that I just attended yesterday or the day before a luncheon for meeting the scholars at JCC who are in the nursing program. I think there are 25 or 26 of them that we were able to give them grants that they would not otherwise be able to attend nursing school. And so it really has been very challenging and very joyful for us.
And done incredibly well and quietly.
Yeah. Well, we were on the radar.
Yeah.
And for many years, and that's probably some part of that is my fault or Carol's fault, because we just sort of wanted to fly under the radar, and basically that didn't stop us from giving this money, but it basically, the Bessemer Trust Company of New York is my co-trustee, and when we came to realize that we were going to end this, they were very emphatic about saying, you've got to make sure that they're not forgotten in the community. Mm-hmm. And so we've said, now you got to do this and you got to do that, and I found these organizations very receptive.
Well, personally, we thank you very much for a lot of good things that have happened.
Yeah.
The organizations which we've been in touch with. Do you find, as you know, John, you've been practicing law for an extended period of time, and are there few things which you reflect back on and say, these are things of which I'm proud of?
Yeah. Well, of course, at the top of the list has to be my role as trustee on Johnson Foundation. Another one would have to be my Swedish consular experience, which I had Carol and I had incredible experiences both in Sweden and in the United States in that era of the 70s, 80s. We met some fabulous people, including the King and Queen on many occasions, ambassadors. I was privileged to be honored by the Swedish government and the King of receiving a knighthood of the Royal Order of Vasa, the Polar Star, by the King. And I had the Polar Star before that. But anyway, I have to tell you a little story about my experience at one time with the Nobel laureates. I'll tell you, we had about 3 experiences of having the Nobel laureates, and Carol and I mean, this was unbelievable, both in New York and in Washington. We had developed friendships with the Consul General and with the ambassador. So we were invited on both occasions where it was just the Nobel laureates and us, which was something. But we when I was to receive my commander status, the king or the ambassador said, "Well, come on early before the Nobel dinner. You and Carol come. If maybe it was 6:30 or something. Come at 6, and we'll go in the library, and I'll make this presentation." So we're all in tails and everything else. And this presentation, I've got this thing, big thing going on around my neck and everything else. So, and it was time for the Nobel laureates to walk in. And I said to the ambassador, I said, "Well, you want me to, I should probably take this off now." And, "Oh, no. You put the, well, Catherine Graham, who was the owner of the Washington Post, came in, and she saw my over there, and she saw this thing. She walks up to me and she says, "And what did you earn your Nobel Prize in?" And I said, "Oh," she introduced herself as Catherine Graham. And I said, "How you doing?" And I said, "Well, Mrs. Graham, I did not win a Nobel, but I have been knighted by the king." And whereupon she did an about face and walked away. but I love to tell that story.
That's a great story. Great story. Well, what a thrill to just be associated with that kind of talent.
Well, we had wonderful trips to Sweden too, and they don't do that anymore. But I would like to say that if you couldn't do the things that we did in Sweden without the ambassador and without the heads of government taking us all there. And we did enormous. We developed a lot of friends both in this country and in Sweden.
You were one of the originating founding members of the Chautauqua Region Community Foundation, which here we are over 30 years later. It's got almost or more than $80 million.
Yep.
How did that get started? How did you get involved in that?
Well, it all started by a meeting that we had. John Hamilton was the principal fellow that was. We went down to JCC. We were invited to, I think it was a breakfast or something down there. And it sort of grew out. What about the idea? We floated the ideas, and I had been thinking about it as well. And we decided to go forward. Fortunately, we had the Gebbe Foundation. He was head of it at the time, and they were very interested in perhaps doing something like this. And a group of us got together, Betty Lene and Sam Price and myself and Miles Lasser and Fran Groh, who was a trust officer, and I'm probably leaving somebody out, but it's a long time ago.
Kenny Strickler was.
Yeah, Ken Strickler was in it. So we all got together, and it evolved over a period of 1-2 years where we would have luncheon meetings and formulate the procedure by which we could do this. We had some expert come in from somewhere, and I remember it up on the second floor of the town club, and he advised us that unless we had $5 million to invest, it wouldn't pay us to do that. Well, $5 million at that time sounded like a heck of a lot of money, and we weren't quite sure whether we could do that, but we charged on. And so Sam Price and I were kind of the legal eagles of the thing, and that's Sam Sr. And then basically we formulated. I'll tell you, we had some awful nice luncheons. But in the way we formulated that, and Sam drew up the papers, and then I incorporated them in Chautauqua County, and we got going. And so we were the original so-called directors, founders, and inventors of it. I don't think that I think Sam and I are the only ones left alive today.
You're right. And it's been turned out to be quite a success story.
Oh yeah, I'm very proud of it because I think they've done a fantastic job.
You're here today in a practice with your son.
Well, I'm retired.
You retired?
Yeah, well, I keep my license. But, there's a special category for people like me that I'm a non-practicing lawyer, but which allows me to keep my license. And I worked too hard to get that license. I'm not about to give it up.
I know some who have quickly turned it in just for the sake of turning it in.
Yeah.
And I say, you got to be kidding me, man.
Yeah. Well, I love to practice the law, and I just it's been good to me, and I just want to continue as long as I can, just to have the companionship of other lawyers.
Well, you have an incredible reputation, John, and it's one where you've been the president of the Bar Association. You've been actively involved. In fact, from a senior, you're probably more involved or as involved as anybody at this kind of senior level. And as you look back on some of the attorneys who were part of your world, do you have a few that were sort of role models that, other than Mike and Clarence, but a few that you said, geez, these guys were something else?
Well, sure. Sherry Cadwell, for one. He was always... He grew up, I mean, I grew up, rather. Practically next door to him. He was just a block away. And he was sort of like a big brother in a way. I mean, basically, he sort of took care of, you know, I'll never forget, Sherry wrote me a letter before I was ever a lawyer, and I was in the Navy, and I was out, and I wasn't going to come home for something, and I was kind of lonely out and all by myself out in California. And I never forget, he wrote me a personal letter he was telling me about his experiences with Jim Tillotson on a boat and going to the Sportsman's Club and everything else. And he was very instrumental in getting me back here. And also, there are many of them. There are many of them. Willard Cass Sr. and, of course, Willard Cass Jr. Willard Cass Sr. was an excellent trial lawyer, and I went up against him several times. And I'll never forget in family court one time I was representing the husband and he was representing the wife, and we were getting down to it. Willard had a way of saying to you, why, he said, this child needs orthodontist work and he can well afford to pay for this. And I said, he ain't going to pay for it. He didn't want to pay for it. He says, you make him pay for it. He says, that's the only thing you can do. You're a lawyer, and you're going to tell him to do that. So I told him, my client, oh yeah, I'll do that. Well, he was instrumental in my early things. Again, Dan and Sam Conti, and I'm trying to think of some of the people that were, and Charlie and Sam Price were always very close friends. The Lombardo and Pickard had a very close relationship with the Price and Miller office because Mike went to work for Wilson Price when he first started out.
Didn't know that.
Yeah.
And that was Walter Miller. He was there at the time.
Yeah.
Within our group, and I remember him again as a very old guy, but Russell Rogerson seemingly being involved in a lot of stuff, which ultimately got a little bit tainted on the one with the Gebby. But was he the sort of the business guy in the area? I mean, representing some of the bigger businesses?
Yeah, well, that's true. And Sherry worked for him. They did a lot of labor work, and he was. And he was very controversial.
Yeah. And was the bar sort of split up into the kind of the civil, commercial type lawyers, and then the criminal lawyers, or did everybody do everything?
Oh, we did. We did everything. I mean, or you mean the bar itself, or?
Well, just the individuals, sort of, were general practitioners.
I think in Jamestown at that time, you took what pretty much came through the door. Everybody did. I mean, we were general lawyers, and you aren't that way anymore. You've got to. Life wasn't so complicated.
This is more for my edification, but it seemed like the firm that first started to get into that sort of specific practices was Johnson, Peterson, Tiener, and Anderson. Kenny sort of started to have guys specialize.
I agree with him.
Yeah. Off camera, I'll tell you a quick story sometime about that. This has been phenomenal. What's the question I should be asking John Sellstrom at this time?
Well, I think you've covered the waterfront pretty well.
I asked Steve if there was some deep, dark question he always wanted to ask you, but he never could. And he said, not today. I don't know what that meant.
Well.
Well, you should be justly proud with everything you've accomplished, John, both privately with your practice, publicly through all these charities. And I've always affiliated you with the Salvation Army. How did that connect occur?
Well, it all started with Bill Anderson. Bill Anderson was the president of the then First National Bank, and in the 1970s, and Bill asked me to go on the advisory board of the Salvation Army because he was instrumental in bringing. He was the membership chairman or something, but he was charged with the responsibility to bring people that he thought would be good as directors. And he asked me, and I said yes. So I got involved with it, and I became chairman, as I say, when I was chairman, and I'm proud to say that Stephen is chairman right now of the Salvation Army, so his interests are continuing with it. And I found that to be an exceptional organization, and I actually went to several conferences, I guess 2 conferences, one in Indianapolis and the other one I think was New York City, where I got to meet some of the leading people in the Salvation Army, and I've always been very impressed with it, and I'm emeritus now, or not emeritus, I'm life member of that, and so that means I get to go whenever I want to, but I just don't have the time at these days to do much now.
So what's next?
Well, basically, when I still have this building, the 4th and Pine building that I'm running. I guess it's time for me to. My father told me one time. He says, "You don't want to rust out. You want to wear out." And so I guess as long as I'm healthy and able to do it, I don't want any grass growing under my feet. I can't stand not having something to do. I mean, I just go nuts if I don't have something to do, and I can't sit home or I can't do these things. It drives me batty, and I have to have a place to go and do something.
It's a good thing you own the building. You still have the key.
Yeah, at this point I do, but who knows? We have a place in South Carolina that we enjoy, and we like to travel, and I think these are things that. But I think the most important thing is, of course, grandchildren and children. At this stage in life, and I'm proud to have 10 grandchildren and 4 children and their husbands and wives, and so that occupies quite a bit of my time.
Well, both of you, both Carol and you, have been such an impact in our community, and I, for one, want to thank you. Also, this is more of a personal note. I know you were involved with Bob Barger and Jay Churchill in
Electroplating.
Yeah. And my dad was one of the owners, and I'm so thrilled the way it's worked, so thrilled the way it happened. My dad had some health issues at that time, and because of the acquisition, they kept him around a while, but it really permitted his health to come back, and to be a wonderful parent and grandparent. So I know you were intimately involved, but I want to just personally thank you for that time period, because that meant a lot to the Peterson family.
Well, that's great, and of course it was wonderful for the Churchill family as well. You know, they I think it was a so-called partnership that was very, very good.
Yeah, it worked out well. But I know you were intimately involved in that stuff.
Well, I handled the purchase of it from their side.
That's right. So thank you. Again, anything else that I should be asking?
No, I don't. I think you've done well.
Well, thank you. This is great, John. I'm glad for the opportunity.
Thank you.
And we'll make sure you get copies of all this.
Oh, that'd be great. I'd like to have my grandchildren take a look at it. And kids, I know they would be interested.
Do you, by the way, just in a postscript, do you remember December 7th, 1941?
I do.
What do you remember about that?
Well, David Carnahan and his parents and myself and my mother and father used to, we all went to the Presbyterian Church. And following the service at the Presbyterian Church, we went to Fredonia to have dinner, Sunday dinner at the White Inn. And I was, at that time, I must have been 8 or 7 or whatever I was at that age. And David and I are the same age, really. So I never forget, we were at the White Inn having dinner when the announcement came over, and everybody at the White Inn was in a state of shock. But I remember David being there, and I was there too. But
did you remember any conversation with your dad or any of the family members as to what that really might mean?
Well, they told us it's war.
Yeah.
And of course, Roosevelt came on the next day and declared war with the Congress, and a day that will live in infamy, you know. And all of that was very scary. I mean, my father, as a result of that, I lived on Lakeview Avenue, and my father he was too old to go in the service, but he became an air raid warden. Have you ever heard of those? Mm-hmm. Well, the air raid wardens were charged. He would go out in the evening, make sure everybody had their lights turned off and everything else, and they were responsible for that. So he had a badge or I think an armband, and I'll never forget that. That was something that scared the life out of you. You know, we might be bombed, and of course with the industry here in Jamestown and the ball bearing thing, that was we were a target. You know, basically.
If Steve were sitting here now, and Steve's practiced law successfully for a long period of time, but what would your advice be to Steve as he's going into the next few years of practice?
Well, I think Steve he's got it pretty well figured out. I'm very proud of Steve because he has my clients now that I had, and he's been able to expand on that a lot. And I hear nothing but wonderful things about Stephen from former clients, from his clients now. And the best tribute to me is they don't call me anymore; they call him, and that's a pretty nice feeling. Yeah. And I would have really no advice. I think he's on the right track, and I'm going down the railroad pretty well.
Plus, he's your tenant.
Yeah, he is. And I foresee the day, though, when probably lawyers, and it's already here, that lawyers can, I found it even true when I was winding up my practice. I can practice from South Carolina, and he's admitted in all these. He's in Florida, South Carolina, Pennsylvania, New York, and so he has clients and all this stuff. But with the modern technology, and I found even when I had a place in Hawaii, I could call my clients, and they didn't know I was in Hawaii. I mean, it just I could do it with computers and everything else, and that's the coming thing. I mean, it'll be soon that I always want a secretary, but I had 4 or 5 secretaries at one time, and you don't need that anymore.
Okay. That's right. This is fantastic, John.
Good.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.